Well, hello, good evening, and welcome everybody to this Geography for Schools lecture series Q&A. And I'm delighted this evening to be joined by Professor Phil Crang, who joins us from home. Good evening to you, Phil.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, very obviously at home, not quite with Al's professional lighting system, but hopefully you can see me out of the gloom of my rather dark living room.
We can see you very well and can hear you just as well. Phil, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is the last of the Q&As that we have for this term, and it's been a fantastic season of lectures and Q&As, and it's lovely to be able to finish with you talking on this subject. So we had several hundred people tune in to your lecture that you gave last week on Facebook and YouTube, all about a world on a plate and thinking through geography through the act of eating and food culture and foodscapes. And I know a lot of people will have got a lot out of that. And certainly the comments that we've received over the past week suggest that's the case. Phil, I just wonder, for people who haven't had a chance to tune into your lecture, so they can still get something out of this Q&A, can you maybe just reprise in a couple of minutes, maybe up to 5 minutes, some of the key things that you were talking about last week? That's kind of, I guess, how I'd like to kick off the session before we start opening up to broader questions. And I think just before we do that, just to say to everybody watching from home, Phil has also produced a fantastic set of resources that teachers and students can download so that you can embed this session in your classroom in ways that work for you, because clearly there are some fantastic connections here with the A-level program. But Phil, let me just turn straight over to you. Thank you.
No, cheers, Al. And yeah, as Al said, if you missed the lecture, you can obviously watch the recording if you want to, but there's also a summary sheet that summarizes the lecture, and there's also a kind of class activity sheet that you can use, to sort of spin off from it. I mean, in terms of summarizing the lecture, I've got a memory like a goldfish, so I've got a few notes here to remind me what it was about that I may occasionally glance down to. But I thought I was going to just try and make 5 points in my 5 minutes. And so I'll take them in turn. So the first one is, look, broadly, that the lecture sits within geography's intellectual interest in ideas about place, a focus on places both near and far, which is an interest that's been very sort of close to my career, but also now features very much in the A-level syllabi. So obviously depends what board, but in the AQA, in the Changing Places module, OCR, the Changing Spaces, Making Places module, Edexcel Pearson, I think it's called the Shaping Places module. So the lecture's designed to key into those areas of the curriculum, but also to speak to some other themes, in particular around globalisation, which is, I know, sort of topic 3 on the Edexcel Pearson syllabus. It does that. So the second point is it does that by substantively focusing on what geographers call foodscapes. Which is a bit jargony, but foodscapes broadly are the places and spaces where we meaningfully encounter food, often through eating it, but it can include other kinds of spaces as well, like media spaces and so on. So the particular focus is on this idea of foodscapes, and that's summarized in the sort of the lecture title, The World on a Plate. If geography as a word means to write the world, then the lecture in some ways is thinking about how geography is served up on our plates and through our foodscapes, where my particular focus was on restaurants and public foodscapes. Then the third aspect of the lecture is it has a particular focus in terms of those foodscapes and their relationship to place more generally. Which is to be interested in the bit of the A-level curriculum that thinks about how places are shaped through the connections that they have to other places. So how places are shaped by what we might call exogenous processes, not just endogenous processes. And that's a particular focus. And it also is a reason why I think often local studies based in particular places are a really nice lens. They open up a kind of place-based lens for studies of supposedly larger scale processes like things like globalization. So the lecture kind of opens up those kinds of issues. Then fourthly, it does that really through discussing 2 main theses about the nature of connections between places, but in the context of, using this example of foodscapes. And the 2 theses in turn, each of them's got a kind of slightly jargonistic term to designate them. The first of those is what we might call the globalisation thesis. And the globalisation thesis associated with a writer called George Ritzer in particular, so it was him who coined that awful word. And what he was interested in there were forms of connections between place that really combined globalisation with corporate growth. So he's interested in the activities of transnational corporations, especially their kind of marketing activities, and how those shaped the relationships between places. And his initial example for developing that was McDonald's, which would be a kind of obvious example of this in terms of how it shapes both places more generally and our foodscapes in particular. So McDonald's, with its 39,000 restaurants in 120 countries, would be an example of this globalization. So the lecture talks a little bit about McDonald's, that kind of thesis of globalization, some of the nuances attached to it. So there's another bit of jargon called glocalization, the ways in which these global phenomena are in some ways localized. And then the second kind of thesis we look at is the bit of jargon here is translocalization. And this is an emphasis on how places are connected less through the operations just of transnational corporations and through more complicated migrations of people, things, and ideas. And I guess in terms of our foodscapes, say in the UK, an example of this would be that the 12,000 so-called Indian restaurants in the UK, they're not generated by the operations of a particular transnational corporation. Some of them are formed into chains, but on the whole, they're not run as kind of large corporations, but there are more Indian restaurants in the UK than there are McDonald's. And their history is about a much more complicated set of interrelationships between the migrations of people, things, and ideas. And that's the kind of translocalization thesis. And again, our foodscapes give us a nice example of that. And then finally, I guess the fifth point that the lecture is trying to open up for people is that we can engage our foodscapes and our local foodscapes as a way of engaging issues around place. So foodscapes are a kind of nice example to think about these wider issues around place. And the class-based activity gives some particular ways of doing that. So it sort of sets out 5 activities that people can do that will open up that kind of study of place through our local foodscapes, and especially those public foodscapes that we can see on things like Google Maps, Google Street View, etc., in terms of the public foodscapes and things like restaurants and takeaways. So that's broadly the terrain of the lecture. Al, does that give us something to start with?
Oh, that gives us a lot to start with, Phil. Thank you so much. You've really your lecture was so thought-provoking, and it certainly made me think about some of the things that actually we just take remarkably for granted, and we don't necessarily always bring to the forefront of our mind. So if last week was the starter, I think we can definitely say that you provided us with the main course today. Thanks so much, Phil. Please do, people watching from home, I can see that there's a good number of people watching. Please do ask any questions that you may have in the comments section on YouTube or Facebook or wherever you're watching, and I can bring forward your question and put it to Phil at any point during the next 20 minutes, half an hour, however long we are together. Phil, in your lecture, or perhaps in preview to your lecture, you mentioned the company Nandos at one point in some of the text that I saw. And I mean, Nandos is a really fascinating organization. And clearly it was in your mind when you were writing the preview. You didn't talk about it explicitly in the lecture. So I wondered, can we just start? Because maybe it will also help us to open up some of these terms and make them real through a case study. Why is Nandos worthy of our academic consideration, as well as just being a place for a cheeky meal out?
Yeah, so my apologies. I don't know how the advertising worked. When I wrote the advertising blurb back in the summer, I said I would talk about McDonald's, Nandos, and Indian restaurants. And but I was also briefed it had to stick to about 25 minutes, and I was at 26. And so Nandos got left off the menu. So apologies for that. When I was thinking about it originally, so I think in that summary, I said, well, look, McDonald's is an example of what you might call a foodscape shaped by these processes of globalization, a form of globalization that's about corporate growth. And then we can debate what the impact is on particular places, but one supposed impact is that places seem to be more and more homogenized. You go everywhere, there's a McDonald's. So in a sense, our places become less dissimilar from each other through those kinds of globalization activities, is at least one of the kind of arguments associated with that. So McDonald's would be an example of globalization. The Indian restaurant would be an example of a rather different history. So the first thing, obviously, to say about the Indian restaurant is, sorry, that was an inverted quote marks I was doing off camera. But the first thing to say about the Indian restaurant is that, in a sense, that's a misnomer in itself. That's a very particular label. That the vast majority of British Indian restaurants are run by British Bengalis and British Pakistanis, some British Indians as well, but they're not purely Indian. They're really about a British sort of South Asian cuisine. But the history of their arrival in Britain, and the lecture talks about this through, is much more about the history of migrations between South Asian Britain and South Asia. So the very earliest Indian restaurants in the UK were in the late 19th century. There's still one of that wave of restaurants still running. There's a restaurant in London called Veeraswamy, which actually opened in 1926. But this was really very much from the age of empire. And these were restaurants opened primarily for either South Asian travellers coming to the imperial metropole, so visiting, coming to London or coming to other parts of Britain. So you've got some restaurants catering for them, but also for people returning from the Raj. So British people who'd been part of the kind of empire infrastructure in South Asia and then wanted a taste of those memories of the Raj when they returned to the UK. And that was the first wave of Indian restaurants. That was quite a small number. And then you get the kind of mass growth of Indian restaurants, much more associated with post-war migrations from South Asia, from East Africa, bringing South Asian people to the UK. And that's when the kind of Indian restaurant becomes a sort of mass phenomenon, really from the 1960s onwards, and becomes part of the kind of high street curry house, etc. So that's a rather different history than the history of McDonald's. It's not one driven by corporate strategy, corporate marketing. It's slightly more complicated history where you've got all kinds of business activities going on, entrepreneurialism, but done around these histories of migration, the history of the movement of particular ingredients or non-movement of ingredients, all of which fashioned a quite distinct British Indian cuisine, which is very different from food in India. So the most obvious example of that, which you go on the kind of, the Google searches, you'll find is chicken tikka masala. Chicken tikka masala is now often labeled as the most popular British food. And that's true in one way. It's the most popular ambient, kind of take-home meal from a supermarket. But it's obviously one of our most popular foods in the UK. Chicken tikka masala doesn't exist in South Asia. It's not a particular South Asian food that's come to Britain. It's a British invention from those South Asian influences. So it was about British South Asian entrepreneurs trying to find dishes that would work in the British market and inventing various foods from their existing culinary knowledge and then readapting that. So that's a kind of slightly more complicated history. Nandos is interesting because it's a kind of combination of the two. So the history of Nandos is broadly peri-peri, which is the kind of spicing, obviously, that Nandos is famous for. That, again, is a part of these kind of colonial histories. So peri-peri is a seasoning which comes from Mozambique in Southeast Africa and is associated with the Portuguese colonization of Mozambique. So it was a kind of hybrid African Portuguese cuisine which developed in Mozambique. It then moved with the migration of Mozambican people to South Africa, and that's where the founders of Nandos encountered it in a small little place. I think it's called Chicken Land, which was a little sort of takeaway in Johannesburg. And the two founders of Nandos bought Chicken Land off the person who was running it, thought they could develop it as a business. I think they developed it to about 4 or 5 restaurants, mostly in Johannesburg. And then it was bought in 1993 by a big sort of venture capitalist company, and it developed Nandos into its, whatever it is now, I think 1,200 branches worldwide in 30 countries. So then Nandos becomes much more like a McDonald's. It becomes this kind of corporate globalization. But the cuisine that Nandos sells is very much something that was produced through those longer histories of migration. It's a sort of hybrid Southeast African cuisine.
Gosh.
All of which is packaged. The logo of Nandos is a sort of Portuguese national symbol. So in a sense, it's packaged as in some ways associated with Portuguese identity. In the kind of rooster symbol of Nandos is, yeah.
Yeah, because of course the symbol is the kind of the black rooster or cockerel.
Yeah, I should have had a picture to hold up, shouldn't I? Yeah, it's called the Rooster of Barcelos, and it's associated with a kind of Portuguese folk tale. But it's a sort of like we have the red rose for England or whatever. It's a kind of Portuguese national symbol. Is now the logo of Nando's. So Nando's, in a sense, sells a kind of placed cuisine that's partly about Portuguese identity, partly about African identity, but does through this kind of corporate franchise system in the same way as McDonald's.
And is now a staple feature on most high streets and most medium-sized towns and larger in the UK.
Yeah, it's in about 30 countries.
And a very local phenomenon here. I mean, I suspect that most people who go for a cheeky Nando's, as my students tell me they often do, would have no idea of the corporate history, the national history, and the way that this particular food culture has moved from Portugal, well, if not Portugal, certainly from Mozambique to South Africa to the UK and elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think that is true. Nando's, in a sense, likes to say a little bit about its history. So I think if you sort of dig around in the Nando's restaurant, there probably is a leaflet somewhere that will tell you something about the history of Nando's, a little bit more than McDonald's does. So McDonald's doesn't really tell you anything. It no longer sells itself as being American. But the earliest McDonald's in some parts of the world did that. They said more about the history of the burger and the history of the company and its genesis in particular kinds of burger cultures in America. But you're right. I think, Nando's, on the whole, we just think of it as being part of our local foodscape without necessarily being aware of all the kinds of transnational connections which are bound up with it. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I've been to Nando's a few times in my life, and I was aware of the South African and Portuguese connection, but the Mozambican connection really is news to me. But of course, that does make sense given that Mozambique was a Portuguese colony and geographically very close to South Africa. So this is really revealing of colonial history, but also there's kind of modern economic connections between the likes of Mozambique, South Africa, and the UK and beyond today, including, of course, then the injection of venture capitalist funding. So there's a whole series of different stages of globalization represented within this restaurant.
Yeah, and I can't say too much more. There's some really interesting literature about the sort of tax arrangements of Nando's as well, which are another part of globalization. But I'm not going to comment on those in a public recording for fear of starting a McNando's libel case or something. But obviously, it operates as a kind of global transnational corporation in various ways. Yeah.
I think, Phil, as in telling that story of Nando's, you also took us back to, in inverted commas, I'll use the same, the Indian restaurant in the UK. And as it happens, a few years ago, I went to Veeraswamy, so I've eaten in there, but I didn't know its history dating back to 1926. So that's again news to me. But I think that story that you told about a kind of let's say a pre-Indian independence, or kind of pre-decolonization presence of Indian restaurants in the UK, and then a post-independence, post-migration story is again really fascinating. So with the wave of migration that came, presumably about after 1947, primarily into the 1960s, 1970s. There was this kind of a new kind of story of Indian cuisine in the UK that you were telling, which is presumably also more kind of family based. It's about families setting up restaurants. But I was also just really intrigued by the fact that we do use the term Indian restaurant when in fact what we probably mean is either Bengali, Bangladeshi, or Pakistani restaurant, and the way that that's become rather flattened in a kind of just pan-Indian or pan-South Asian identity. Was that a deliberate? Where does that come from, do you think? Was that a deliberate strategy, or is that just something that has evolved as a kind of a lazy shorthand?
Yeah, so partly it's about a sort of marketing shorthand, and it's also been more complicated in recent years. So there's a wonderful trade magazine that ran for quite a while called Tandoori magazine, which sort of traces out this history actually. No, it's really about the lazy shorthand of that British people had about South Asia.
Yeah,
is that in the word India, partly through the history of empire, when India meant the sort of South Asian elements of the British Empire,
prior to partition, India
stood for, in a sense, the whole of South Asia. It's not quite as simple as that, though, because obviously if you look at restaurants today, and this is one of the class exercises that people could do, is if you went and looked at, did your sort of restaurant and takeout filter in your local area, you might find some restaurants that don't market themselves simply as Indian. So they might, for example, be regionalized in various ways. They might talk about having Goan cuisine or Kerala cuisine or Nepalese cuisine, etc. So there would be a pushback against that sort of very generic Indianness, and that's something that's emerged, especially I guess over about the last 20, 30 years, where Indian restaurants, in a sense, partly to diversify and to distinguish themselves, sometimes to, in a sense, pitch their cuisine as being more authentic, would look for other designations other than simply being an Indian restaurant. And that often might be slightly more regionalized. Sometimes that also came out of a kind of local politics, so a kind of a local community politics. So if you go to Bangla Town in the East End of London, which is around Brick Lane, most of the restaurants there are very clear that they're Bangladeshi restaurants. Elsewhere in the UK, that may be less apparent. So there'll be Bangladeshi restaurants that don't bill themselves as being Bangladeshi, but as part of kind of local pride and a sort of trans-local pride, in Bangla Town, it's very clearly signalled as being about Bangladeshi restaurants. So the complications there of what's happened in a sense, where that generic singular idea of a kind of Indian restaurant has got more complicated. And that's also involved moves up market. So I think in the lecture I mentioned the moves where you will get restaurants of South Asian cuisine that are really engaging with other kinds of cuisine, so modern French cuisine, modern British cuisine in various ways. And hence, in a sense, I think would view the label just being an Indian restaurant as kind of somewhat, as you said, flattening, and they want to just, they're distinguishing themselves within that. So if you go to a restaurant like the Cinnamon Club, which I haven't had the good fortune of eating in, I've been and interviewed the people who run it, but I haven't ever eaten in it.
Neither have I. I can't claim this one.
But it's one of the Michelin-starred kind of South Asian restaurants in the UK. Their history, again, is very different. It's about particular venture capitalists running an expensive restaurant and importing the chef staff from South Asia. So Vivek Singh, who's the executive chef there, was trained through the Taj Hotel group in right. India, and then came over to the UK.
That's really fascinating, and I am interested in this idea of kind of authenticity and people, like, first of all, consumers looking for more, in inverted commas, authentic experiences, and restaurants seeking to deliver them. And I mean, that does seem to be a bit of a trend that has developed over recent times. People searching out something that's different, that has a stronger connection to a particular originating place. And I just wonder, are there different waves of food culture that we can see here? I mean, clearly, McDonald's is a vast global business. I don't think anybody would bet against its continuing success. But I also just wonder whether the environmental climate, the climate of changing consumer habits, are things moving against McDonald's and perhaps towards some of these other, at least more authentic feeling kind of restaurants? Can we be so bold as to make those kind of claims and assertions? Or do you think that the food ecosystem is now so rich that it can accommodate all of these different diets, so to say?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know if I've got a good answer to that. I'm really pleased you asked the question, though, because I'll flag for the people listening in. There are some really nice resonances here with, I think, the A-level curriculum. So it's partly about how the A-level curriculum thinks about place that I think we're getting into here. And it's also partly about, there are some, I think the EdXL curriculum has a sort of future of food module where you can think about some of these issues around kind of industrialized food systems and whether we'll move away from them into other kinds of food systems. And obviously McDonald's is caught up in things like those industrialized food systems to some degree. Around place, what I'm interested in is the question you're asking, I think, raises this issue about how, when we think about foodscapes, we're both thinking about the kinds of places that we encounter locally, but we're also thinking about how they represent other places. So in the A-level curriculum, there's quite, I think, a strong and very appropriate interest in not only places that we directly experience, but in places that are kind of mediatized in various ways or represented in various ways. And we can think about that in novels or in film or in TV. But actually, food culture is one of the ways that places are mediatized for us and represented to us. So something like an Indian restaurant is a representation of some other places that are being presented to us. You can analyze an Indian restaurant, its menu, its decor, how it markets itself in the same way as you can analyze a TV program or a travel program about India and how it represents parts of India. So I think that's the first thing. The point you're making there is that the question around authenticity is really around representation, about how places are represented. And foodscapes are a really neat way of thinking about places as something we both directly experienced and that are representational. And often we can do both of those things can be happening at the same time. So I think it's a really interesting question on that. On the more substantive point about, are we seeing a sort of fundamental transformation in our foodscapes? Possibly, though obviously people like McDonald's have been very sensitive to this. So McDonald's, for example, would separate out some aspects of its corporate structure from, and where it heavily standardizes and tries to control quite strongly from, for example, its supply chain structure. So McDonald's for years has been running adverts about how it sources locally. So uses British beef, British potatoes, or I think it normally says the British Isles, because the Republic of Ireland is a big supplier into its supply chains in the UK. But they've been making moves on that for quite a while. So I think McDonald's, for example, are very conscious of the kind of the so-called brand boomerang, the fact that they're a very famous brand, that they become a kind of poster child of everything that's wrong with an industrialized food system. And then they try, in a sense, counteract that. So they will try quite deliberately to market themselves as being local in various ways, as much more localized. So I think that the shifts here are probably not so much about phases, they're more about dynamics that these different kinds of processes are grappling with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, as you know, Phil, I'm a political geographer, so I was watching things like the COP26 in Glasgow with a great deal of interest in terms of environmental politics. But one of the things I thought was really interesting that ran alongside the COP was this discussion of a certain kind of food diplomacy that seemed to be taking place. I don't know if you're aware of this, but like Nicola Sturgeon, for example, presented a number of different world leaders and congressmen and congresswomen with cans of Iron Brew as a way of kind of almost representing, a particular kind of Scottish food culture. Somebody reported, in fact, a number of the diplomats who were there reported going to have a deep fried Mars bar as a traditionally kind of Glaswegian kind of experience. And I was just really reflecting on the way that food actually does become part of political and diplomatic life as well. You know, of course, ambassadors are frequently invited to kind of state banquets and things like that. So, you know, food really is one of these kind of global currencies that enables diplomacy, that forms part of politics, that is clearly part of an incredibly complex global economic ecosystem. And I think what you've so neatly done is for me anyway, it's you've brought it back to a kind of highly localized sense of place and space as well. I wonder if any of that kind of leads you to reflect on anything.
Well, it's partly about that representational power of food again, isn't it? The way foods can operate as national symbols has obviously been key for a very long time. So the English as les roast beef or whatever. So, but yes, Iron Brew and Scottish identity was a great part, wasn't it, of COP26. So, and it's interesting that can be quite commercial brands then take on a kind of set of meanings. Now, some of that operates slightly, but it's more at a national scale than perhaps place-based, but some of it's place-based. So there's some really interesting work by an economic geographer called Andy Pike around kind of brand geographies. And he's interested in things like Newcastle Brown Ale and the ways in which you get certain kinds of brewing industries based on place marketing. And those become quite complicated stories. So when Newcastle Brown Ale no longer is only sold in Newcastle, isn't necessarily brewed directly in Newcastle, I think it's now in Gateshead, but then is shipped to the States and becomes a big sort of marketing push in the States. How Newcastle gets presented becomes something rather different in the States than it would be in England. So really interesting stories around how those kinds of relations between foods and drinks, national and local identities, and then how those travel and become part of kind of commercial cultures, I think is a really interesting story for me. And I think you open up the remarks by saying it's really interesting about how geographies these are kind of everyday things that we don't reflect upon. And that's a kind of classic move in geography, isn't it? Is that one of the really fascinating things about geography is if it is about writing the world, well, the world's all around us. It's there in our kind of everyday, boring, commonplace events and goods and materials, and you can actually see that in our foods. There's a whole host of kind of geographical stories there to be unpicked and told.
Yeah, Phil, I'm conscious of time, and I think we have a couple more minutes left. I'd say I think you're right. When I think about when I saw the title of your lecture, I thought you might be talking about those kind of I forgot geographical identifiers or geographical signifiers for food. The way we protect particular identities like Melton Mowbray pies and Dundee cake, and of course champagne is very protective of its identity and its association with that product and the place that it's from. And of course, the European Union was an important part of codifying that structure. And I suspect that in post-Brexit UK, there's these things now have to be thought about. Are we going to be similarly protective of things, but also can we be as protective now that we don't have that?
Well, we're setting up a sort of parallel system. So there is a kind of post-Brexit parallel system where things are getting these geographical indications reapproved, etc. So that's happening, and that's part of the kind of, I guess, the trade and cooperation agreement is food designations have been a big part of that, about mutual recognition of each other's food designations. You're right. There's a brilliant set of geographical studies doing this. A past dissertation student did his dissertation on Melton Mowbray pork pies, etc. So there are really great studies to be done there. I think the reason I didn't focus on that so much is I was trying to key this very much, I think, into the A-level focus, which is on this idea of kind of local places and local place studies. And clearly, for some people, if you're in an area where that's part of your local place identity, or these geographical indications, that's a wonderful example to kind of work with and to use. The other example of that, I guess, would be where sort of neighborhoods are place branded, or place branding activities work around food cultures in various ways. And I think in the talk, I mentioned things like the Balti Triangle in Birmingham as an example of that. But there would be other examples of that where places are kind of place branded through food in various ways. And that's again, I know place branding is a particular interest in the A-level curriculum, so it's a kind of nice example to try and work that through.
And famously Curry Mile in Manchester as well. Yeah, I mean, I think that is really interesting, and it's how those brands emerge. Do they emerge naturally from the community who come to know these places, or are they strategized by clever place branders, or potentially a combination of both of those things?
Yeah, normally a combination of both of those things. But say something like Bangla Town in the East End of London was a deliberate push by Tower Hamlets Council to give the Brick Lane area a particular kind of branding, which they thought might be kind of effective. Yeah.
Phil, I think the time has just ticked past 32 minutes, so I think we'll probably draw it to a close. A huge thanks to you. You've taken us on a journey from Indian restaurants in the 1920s through to Melton Mowbray pies via deep fried Mars bars and cans of Iron Brew. So if that's not left us all hungry for more, then I don't know what will.
It's very hard to avoid the corny puns when you're doing a food.
I know it really is. Phil, just hang on 1 second, because what I want to do now is just want to raise for everybody's attention a couple of things that are coming up next year. So this is the last of the Geography for Schools lecture series for this term. But coming up in January, we've got Dr. Ollie Mould, who will be talking about gentrification in the global city, again with really obvious connections to the A-level program. And then on the 24th of January, we've got Celia Martin Puertas, who's talking about global atmospheric and ocean circulation systems, again with a really strong connection to the physical geography part of the curriculum. And on the week after both of these dates, we have the live Q&As again. And then slightly later in the term, on the 7th of February, we've got David Simon talking about sustainable cities are accessible, green, blue, and fair, with a particular context of Nanjing in that particular lecture. And then Adrian Palmer talking about patterns of glacier retreat. So lots of things covering both human and physical geography. Every one of those lectures and Q&As will be supported with teaching resources that you can use in the classroom or to help with your revision. Phil, it's just left to me to say thank you to you one more time for tonight's Q&A and for last week's lecture. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
No, you're very welcome. And thank you to all of the speakers that we've had this term. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks everybody for joining us at home. Please keep giving us your feedback for any topics that you might like to have for future talks. We're very responsive to any ideas that you've got. So keep sending us ideas, keep sending us comments, things that we can do better. We'd really love to hear from you. Phil, thanks again.